What do you think you are? A truck driver playing dress up? Watch your bag next time. You hear that? Guy talks like he's got somewhere to be. Dad, please don't fight him. Excuse us. Step outside. Let her see what you're worth. Marcus Reed had never learned the difference between being feared and being respected. That night in the Arizona diner, he saw exactly what he wanted to see. A middle-aged trucker in worn clothes sitting with a quiet daughter who looked like she wanted to disappear. He saw a soft target. He was wrong about almost everything. The man he had just mocked had spent more than 2 decades in environments where stillness wasn't politeness, it was training. Where restraint wasn't weakness, it was discipline forged in places that don't appear on any record. Marcus had pushed. Walter hadn't pushed back. That calm was the only warning Marcus was going to get. Whether he was smart enough to understand it was another question entirely. The Kenworth had close to 900,000 miles on it. Walter Briggs knew every sound it made, the way the engine settled differently in cold rain, the slight pull to the left on wet pavement, the particular creak of the driver's door he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years but never got around to because there was always something more important. A school play. A parent-teacher conference. A birthday that couldn't be missed. He had built his entire working life around a single requirement, routes that let him be home regularly, not occasionally, because his daughter was 12, and 12 was the age when being present in the ordinary ways still mattered more than anything he could offer from a distance. Diane had passed 6 years earlier. He didn't talk about it often, and Emma had learned not to push. What she knew about her father was simpler and more concrete than the parts she couldn't name. That he woke before she did and made breakfast without being asked. That he had never missed a single school event. She could remember that on the rare mornings when she found him sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his eyes fixed on something beyond the window, she would sit beside him and he would come back always. What Emma didn't know, what she had no real framework for, was the shape of the life he'd lived before she was old enough to ask questions. She knew he'd served in the Navy. She knew it had been a long time. There was something in the pauses between his sentences, in the particular way he scanned a room before he chose where to sit, in the quality of stillness he carried, that seemed different from ordinary calm. But she was 12, and the world her father had built for her was warm and predictable and smelled like road coffee and pancakes, and she had no reason yet to look past that. It was summer break. He'd brought her along on a short leg, Prescott west toward Flagstaff, 1 delivery, 1 night on the road, back by Sunday. She had a window seat and a sketchbook, 2 weeks of careful pencil drawings of birds she'd spotted through the Kenworth's glass. She was in the middle of telling him about a girl named Kayla who had said something unfair about a group project when the door of the diner opened and 3 men came in from the rain. The tallest one entered first. He moved the way people move when they've learned, through years of being the most physically dominant person in whatever room they occupy, that spaces adjust for them. That conversation's quiet, that eyes track them, that the general atmosphere of a place shifts slightly upon their arrival. Marcus Reed was 28 years old, 6'2", built in the specific proportions that made his profession legible to anyone who paid attention to that world. He held a record of 15 wins and 0 losses across 4 years of professional MMA competition. His gym in Phoenix had close to 200 members, and his name had started appearing in the kinds of conversations that precede significant promotional deals. Behind him, Derek and Tyler moved with the practiced ease of men who had spent enough time in someone else's orbit that they'd stopped questioning the direction they were traveling. Marcus dropped his training bag onto the counter. He didn't look to see whether there was room. He dropped it the way people drop things when the idea of inconveniencing someone else hasn't occurred to them in long enough that it no longer registers. The bag was heavy and it landed wrong, sliding sideways across the counter and catching the coffee mug at the end. The mug tipped and its contents spread across the surface in a dark fan that reached the edge of the table where Walter and Emma were sitting, catching the corner of Emma's sketchbook before either of them could react. Walter's hand went to Emma's arm first. He turned her toward him, checked her hands, checked the skin at her wrist where the coffee had come closest. She wasn't hurt. He made sure of that before he did anything else. Then he looked up at Marcus and said quietly that the bag had hit his daughter's things, and asked him to be more careful. Marcus looked at him. He took in the faded work shirt, the road-worn boots, the trucker's cap sitting on the seat beside Walter's plate, and something settled into his expression, not quite contempt, not quite amusement, something in between that belongs to people who've decided before a conversation begins that the other party doesn't merit full engagement. He didn't apologize. He said something instead about how people who sit near counters in busy diners should expect things to happen. Derek laughed. Tyler was already looking at his phone. Walter turned back to Emma. He asked whether the sketchbook had been damaged, whether she wanted to move to the other side of the booth. The cover was stained, but the pages inside were mostly dry. Emma said it was fine, though she was watching Marcus now with the specific attention of a child who has registered that something in a room has gone sideways but doesn't know how far. Marcus was irritated, and the irritation had a particular quality. It wasn't anger about the spilled cup or the brief exchange. It was the irritation of a man who had just been addressed as though he were expected to comply, and had then watched that same man turn away without waiting to see whether he would. He wasn't accustomed to being dismissed. He was accustomed to rooms that noticed him, to people who found reasons to look in his direction, to the specific social gravity that comes from being young and physically formidable and visibly successful. The trucker in the worn boots hadn't done any of those things. He'd made his request and returned to his daughter as though Marcus's response wasn't something he was tracking. Marcus moved closer to the table and made a comment about the clothes, not the word exactly, but the meaning was clear. The implication that a man who drove freight for a living was a particular kind of man. He said it the way people say things they want to pass off as observations. Emma's hand found her father's arm under the table. Walter set his fork down. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Marcus steadily, the way someone looks at something they've already assessed and categorized and don't need to spend additional energy on, and told him that he'd asked once to be careful, and that was going to be the only time he asked. Then he reached into his jacket, placed enough cash on the table to cover dinner and a tip, and stood. He put one hand on Emma's shoulder and guided her toward the door. It was a clean exit, the kind designed to end something before it has to become something else. Most people, needing that particular quality of stillness, the stillness of someone who has already decided and carries no uncertainty about the decision, would have let it end there. Would have turned back to their food and their friends and the rest of a normal evening. Marcus was not most people. He called after them as they moved toward the entrance. His voice carried across the diner clear enough that several tables turned. He said something about running, said it in a way that put Emma at the center of it, specifically designed to make the departure something a daughter would remember. Derek's expression shifted. Tyler had put the phone down. Walter held the door for Emma and followed her into the rain without responding. The parking lot was wet and poorly lit, the overhead lights turning everything a dull amber. The Kenworth sat at the far end of the lot where there was room for the rig. Emma moved toward it. Walter walked a step behind her, the rain beginning to collect on his jacket. They were halfway across the lot when Marcus came through the door. He hadn't made a fully conscious decision. Or if he had, it had come from the part of him that had never genuinely lost, that had walked out of 15 professional fights without a single one going the wrong way, that had built an identity so completely around being the most dangerous man in any given room that someone simply choosing to leave without acknowledging that reality felt like a structural threat to something he couldn't quite name. He walked fast. He got around Walter and planted himself between the man and the truck. He said it loud enough for Emma to hear. That was the calculation, that was the point, asking whether Walter didn't want his daughter to know what kind of man her father really was. Walter stopped walking. Not because the words had landed anywhere they were meant to. He'd been called worse things by worse people in places where the stakes involved considerably more than an Arizona parking lot. He stopped because Emma was 10 feet behind him, and because the man had made her part of this deliberately, and that changed what the moment required. He turned around. He looked at Marcus with the flat, unhurried clarity of someone who had already taken inventory and filed the result. He said quietly that his daughter was watching, and asked Marcus not to make her witness something they'd both regret. Marcus heard it as fear. He came in with a left hook, a real one, thrown with the full rotation of his hips and the coordinated weight of 210 pounds of trained muscle. It was the kind of punch that had ended professional fights. Against anyone shaped by ordinary experience, it would have been enough. Walter had not been shaped by ordinary experience. He'd spent more than 2 decades being trained in environments where the person across from you wasn't trying to win, they were trying to end you. And that difference in orientation rewires the body's responses at a level below conscious thought. He read the setup of Marcus's shoulder in the fraction of a second before the hook completed. Instead of retreating, he stepped inside the arc, into the space where the punch carried no real force, and what followed wasn't a fight in any recognizable sense. There was no exchange, no back and forth. Marcus's balance broke before he understood it was breaking. He went face down onto the wet pavement. Walter was behind him, controlling the arm, the weight distributed with the settled precision of someone performing a task they'd done so many times it no longer required thought. He had the arm locked. He could feel the joint at its limit. One additional pound of pressure in the right direction would produce damage that would take months to repair and might never fully reverse. The choice was entirely his. He didn't take it. He said one word. Tap. For a moment, Marcus's whole body resisted every competitive instinct, every reflex built from 15 undefeated bouts, every piece of identity he'd assembled over 28 years, telling him this simply couldn't be happening. Then his right hand came down against the wet pavement. Once. A second time. Walter released him and stood. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Derek or Tyler, standing near the diner entrance in the particular stillness of men who had watched something move in a direction they didn't expect. He walked back to Emma, who had her sketchbook pressed against her chest, rain on her face, and eyes that were trying to reconcile the man on the ground with the father she had known every day of her life. He asked if she was all right. She nodded without speaking, and he guided her the rest of the way to the Kenworth. He helped her up into the passenger side, came around to the driver's door, got in, started the engine. The wipers came on and cleared the glass, and the diner fell away in the side mirrors as he pulled onto the access road. Emma sat quietly for several minutes, the sketchbook in her lap. Then she told him she hadn't known he could do that. Walter merged onto the interstate and settled into the right lane. The rain had thickened, and the road ahead was a long, straight line of wet asphalt going west into the dark. He said he'd learned it a long time ago, and that he hoped she wouldn't have to think too much about it. She asked what he meant by that. He said that being capable of something and needing to use it were two very different things, and that most of the time the second one never came up if you handled the first one correctly. Emma looked at her father's profile. The face she'd known her whole life, the hands easy on the wheel. The same man who made her breakfast and came to her school plays and sat with her at kitchen tables in the early morning. She said nothing more. The truck moved west through the rain, and somewhere behind them, in a parking lot off Interstate 17, Marcus Reed was getting to his feet for the first time in 15 fights, trying to understand what had just been done to him and by whom. The days after the diner were among the worst Marcus had experienced in years. The pain in his shoulder was only a small part of it. He could manage pain. He'd built his professional life around managing pain, around pushing through it, training past it, using it as confirmation the work was real. What he couldn't manage, what followed him from the moment he woke up until the moment he finally fell asleep each night, was the image of the wet parking lot and the single word that had come out of that encounter. Tap. His own hand against the asphalt. His own voice somewhere in his body issuing the signal that ended it. He'd made that sound 15 times in training over 4 years. Always controlled, always a tactical choice, always in a room where he could stand up afterward and the meaning of it would dissolve back into the normal business of preparation. This time it hadn't dissolved. It was still there every morning when he walked into his gym and his members looked at him and he looked back at them, and he couldn't fully tell what they saw. Derek and Tyler hadn't said a word to anyone. He'd made sure of that in the first conversation he had with them afterward, and they'd agreed quickly, which told him they were as unsettled as he was. But agreement wasn't the same as forgetting. And the problem with people who witnessed something they weren't supposed to witness was that the knowledge sat in the room with them whether they spoke it or not. He could see it in the way Derek held eye contact a half-second shorter than usual, in the way Tyler filled silences at the gym with noise that hadn't been necessary before. The dynamic between the three of them had shifted in some precise and irreversible way, and the shift itself was maddening because the only explanation for it was a tap-out loss to a truck driver in a parking lot during a rainstorm. Marcus had started the reconstruction the same night. He'd lain in bed with his shoulder packed and gone back through it piece by piece, looking for the place where the math stopped adding up. The mileage differential was the most obvious starting point. He was 28, trained daily, undefeated at a professional level, 210 pounds of muscle systematically optimized for combat. Walter Briggs was 49. He drove freight. He wore a work shirt and road boots and had a 12-year-old daughter who drew birds in a sketchbook. The logic said the outcome of that parking lot should have gone one way, and it had gone another, which meant one of three things. Either the logic was wrong about Walter, or the conditions had been wrong, the wet pavement, the bad angle, the element of surprise, or Walter had simply gotten lucky. Marcus spent the better part of a week weighing those three options, and landed, by force of will more than reason, on the second and third. He made calls. He had contacts in the regional freight industry, people who moved between the trucking and sporting worlds through shared gym memberships and overlapping social circles. Through two of those contacts, he located what he was looking for. Walter Briggs, independent owner-operator, single Kenworth, regional routes throughout Arizona. The record was clean and ordinary and contained nothing that explained the parking lot. The next delivery on the Kingman corridor was scheduled for early the following week, arriving at a steel processing facility in the industrial district outside the city around 1 in the morning. Derek pushed back when Marcus laid it out. Not loudly, that wasn't how Derek operated, but he said plainly that the diner had been one thing, and this was going in a different direction, and he wanted to say so before they went further. Tyler sat with his forearms on his knees and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. Marcus told them it wasn't a fight. He said he needed to see the man again on different ground, without rain and a parking lot surface working against him. He said it with the particular conviction of someone who's already finished the argument internally and is now performing it for an audience rather than conducting it. Neither Derek nor Tyler fully believed it wasn't going to be a fight, but neither found the words to stop it, and by then the gravity of Marcus's certainty had been carrying them for long enough that breaking from it required a kind of deliberate resistance they hadn't practiced. Walter had dropped Emma at her aunt's house 2 days after the drive back from Flagstaff. It was a Sunday evening, warm and clear, and Emma had hugged him at the door with the particular thoroughness of a 12-year-old who had decided something without putting it into words. Just before he turned back to the truck, she asked him whether the man from the diner would come looking for him. Walter told her no. He said it with a smile that was entirely convincing, then walked back to the Kenworth and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He had known men like Marcus Reed, not this specific man, but the shape of him, the specific architecture of ego and physical capability that produces that kind of behavior in a parking lot. He'd known enough of them to know how rarely they resolve quietly. The ache in that knowledge had nothing to do with fear for himself. It had everything to do with the fact that his daughter was no longer in the truck, and that this was the first time since Sunday night he'd felt fully free to think about what was probably coming. The steel facility sat inside a cluster of low industrial buildings west of the city, surrounded by chain link and open yard. At 1 in the morning, the district was empty in the specific way industrial zones are empty at that hour. Not absent of light, but absent of movement, the amber glow of security lamps sitting on everything without purpose. Walter came in on the access road with the Kenworth running right, the delivery paperwork organized on the passenger seat, his window cracked to the night air. He'd made this run before. He knew where the receiving bay was, how long the offload typically took, approximately what time he'd be back on the highway. The headlights of a Ford Raptor came out of the dark from a gap between two buildings and swung across the road in front of him. Walter applied the brakes with the steadiness of someone who wasn't surprised, because on some level he'd been expecting a version of this since Sunday. The Kenworth came to a stop. He sat for a moment in the cab looking at the truck blocking the road, then opened the door and stepped down. Marcus was already out of the Raptor. He came around the front of it without rushing, and Derek and Tyler came out of the passenger side, and in the flat industrial light, Walter could see what they were carrying. The flashlights were heavy, the solid aluminum kind, long enough that the weight in a swing would carry real consequence. This was no longer the parking lot outside a diner. This had been organized. Someone had found his route, his schedule, his destination. The gap between what Marcus had let himself become and what he was willing to do to get here was no longer something that could be attributed to a bad night and a short temper. Marcus said it loud in the open air. No rain now, no wet pavement. 3 against 1, and no little girl watching. He said it like a man presenting evidence that something had been proven wrong and was about to be corrected. Walter took off his cap and set it on the step of the Kenworth. He'd made a choice at the diner to be a particular kind of man for his daughter, and that choice had been the right one, and he didn't regret it. But the parameters of the situation had changed completely. Emma was safe at her aunt's house. The 3 men across from him had done the planning and the travel and arrived here with weapons and intent. Whatever obligation he'd had to model restraint for a 12-year-old who was watching, he'd discharged it. What remained was simpler. The tiredness left his face. Something else replaced it, not aggression, not excitement, just clarity, the particular kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and having done it enough times that the procedural elements no longer require conscious attention. Tyler came first, and the honest reason was that he was trying to perform rather than act. He wanted Marcus to see him commit, so he committed early and without the discipline that genuine commitment requires. He swung the flashlight in a wide arc aimed at Walter's head, a powerful swing with real weight behind it. But the arc was wide, which meant there was a moment, brief and available only to someone trained to see it, where the weapon was extended and the body behind it was open. Walter didn't move backward. He moved forward and to the inside, the counterintuitive response, the one Tyler had no reference point for, because nothing in Tyler's experience had prepared him to deal with someone who treated an incoming swing as an invitation to close distance. The grip came off the flashlight. A short, controlled movement brought Tyler's center of gravity past recoverable, and Walter guided him down, not through him, guided him with the care of someone who'd chosen the outcome in advance. Tyler went to his knees and then onto his side, and he stayed there, not because he was unconscious, but because every instinct in his body was telling him that the man standing over him had made a very deliberate choice not to do more, and that moving might renegotiate that choice. Derek watched it happen. He was standing 8 feet away with the second flashlight hanging at his side. He looked at Tyler on the ground, then at Walter, and something in him that had been silently objecting for the better part of a week finally reached the surface. He set the flashlight on the ground. He said he was done, 2 words, quiet, almost conversational. Then he looked at Marcus, and there was something in the look that was not apology and not accusation, just a kind of blunt honesty the situation had finally forced out of him. He said he hadn't signed up for whatever this actually was. He walked backward until he reached the side of the Raptor and sat down against the wheel well. Marcus stood alone. He'd come here with a theory that the parking lot had been weather and bad luck and an angle he hadn't anticipated, that on fair ground, with clear conditions, the math would correct itself. He came at Walter now with everything the theory required of him, and what happened instead was something worse than losing. Walter didn't fight him the way a fighter fights. He absorbed and redirected, moved with Marcus's force rather than against it, turned each committed attack into a problem of geometry and weight distribution. When Marcus grabbed for a clinch against the side of the Kenworth, Walter let him get it, then rotated, and suddenly Marcus's right arm was extended behind him at an angle his own body was working against. The lock was total. Walter held it with the settled stillness of someone who had done exactly this, in exactly this way, more times than he could usefully count. He didn't crank the arm. He held it at the threshold, enough pressure to make the joint's limit fully felt, not enough to decide on damage. It was a choice he'd made consciously in the fraction of a second when it became available, and it was the same choice he'd made in the parking lot. He'd already decided on the outcome he wanted. Marcus's destruction wasn't part of it. What Marcus did next was the thing Walter couldn't fully control. His competitive nervous system, 15 fights worth of reflex and reaction, the deep conditioning of someone who had never genuinely been cornered, fired before his rational mind could intervene. He wrenched. Not a tactical move, not a calculated attempt to create space, just a raw pull driven by something in him that couldn't process the existence of the lock. The ligaments and tendons in his right hand gave way under the torque of his own resistance. Walter felt it happen and released the hold immediately, but the damage was done before the release, produced entirely by the force of Marcus's own attempt to escape something that had no escape. Marcus went to one knee. He gripped his right hand with his left and held it against his chest, and the color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with stubbornness. The hand was already swelling. Walter stood in the amber light of the industrial yard, breathing normally, not marking the moment in any visible way. Then the sirens came. 3 patrol cars swung into the access road with their lights cutting the dark, and in their headlights the scene arranged itself. Tyler on the ground, Derek against the wheel well, Marcus kneeling with his injured hand, and Walter standing beside the Kenworth with no visible damage worth mentioning. Marcus looked up at the lights and made his calculation in the seconds he had before doors opened. He said loudly and clearly that Walter had attacked them. He said it with the conviction of someone who'd decided that if he couldn't win the physical confrontation, he'd shift the terrain to the narrative one, where the numbers were better and the optics, one older trucker against 3 younger athletes, might carry him through. The officers fanned out with weapons drawn and gave their orders. Walter raised his hands and complied with no variation, no hesitation, the way someone complies who has practice with the protocol and no anxiety about the process. One of the patrol cars was the last to arrive, and the man who stepped out of it moved differently from the others. He was older than the responding officers, and he walked with the unhurried authority of someone whose rank had been settled long enough that he'd stopped performing it. Captain Frank Dawson covered the distance across the yard at his own pace, and when he got close enough to see the man standing with his hands up beside the Kenworth, he stopped. He covered the remaining distance, stood in front of Walter, lowered his own weapon, and stood straight. Then he brought his right hand up in a military salute, formal and clean, and said the name with the weight of someone who had once operated under that rank and had never fully stopped carrying it. Commander Briggs. Walter looked at him for a moment with something that might have been the faintest version of a smile. He said he was driving trucks now, Frank. Dawson held the salute another second, then let his hand down and turned toward Marcus with an expression that had reorganized itself into something considerably more official than it had been at the start of the exchange. Marcus was looking at Walter with an expression still trying to resolve. This had rearranged things in a way his mind was working through in real time. Every detail he'd compiled about the man, the faded work shirt, the road boots, the ordinary freight schedule, was still true, and none of it explained what was happening. Dawson told Marcus, with the economy of someone who saw no reason to elaborate beyond what was necessary, that the man he'd tracked to an industrial yard in the middle of the night had spent more than 2 decades in special operations and had spent the last years of that career commanding an elite SEAL unit. He told him this not for Marcus's benefit, but because the information was relevant to determining what had occurred here and why. Marcus said he didn't care who the man used to be. He said it loudly, with the last available remnant of the certainty he'd arrived with. Walter walked to the front of the Kenworth without responding and pointed to the dash cam housing. Dawson looked at it, looked at Walter, then looked at Marcus, and the expression on Marcus's face shifted as he followed the logic to its end, because he knew even before anyone accessed the footage what a dash cam on an owner-operator's truck was built to capture and how long it had been running. The camera had been running since before the Raptor came out of the dark. It had captured the truck blocking the road, the 3 men stepping out, the flashlights, Marcus's voice laying out the terms of what he'd come to do. The sequence of events was not ambiguous. The responding officers began moving through their procedures. Tyler was helped to a sitting position and assessed. Derek answered every question asked of him in full. The Raptor's keys were collected as evidence. Marcus's wrists came together behind him, and the cuffs went on, and he stood in the industrial light with his injured hand and his undefeated record in every plan he'd constructed over the past week now fully exhausted. Walter looked at none of it. He turned to Dawson and asked, in the same tone he might have used to check a weather forecast, whether he'd be able to get the delivery offloaded before morning. Dawson said he thought they could make that work. Marcus heard the question and stood very still. The man whose life he'd just spent a week reorganizing around the project of confronting had asked, as his first concern, about a freight delivery. The triviality of it, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that Marcus Reed, or this night, or any of it had registered as something significant, did more damage than any physical outcome could have produced, because what it meant was undeniable. It meant that Walter had looked at him at the diner, and looked at him in the parking lot, and looked at him here in this industrial yard at 1 in the morning, and had arrived each time at the same assessment. Not a rival, not a threat worthy of sustained attention, just a problem to be managed on the way to somewhere else. For months after Kingman, the surgeon was precise and unhurried, the way surgeons are when the news they're delivering isn't an emergency but a permanent reclassification of someone's future. He told Marcus that the tendon damage in his right hand was significant, that the repair had gone as well as could be expected, and that return to professional competition at his previous level was unlikely. He used the word unlikely with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that the word impossible produces a particular kind of grief that complicates the recovery process. Marcus sat in the exam room with his hand in its wrapping and heard the word and understood, in a way different from intellectual comprehension, that 15 and 0 was the final number. That there wouldn't be a 16th fight. That the record he'd built his entire identity around had closed while he was on his knees in an industrial yard in Kingman, with a man standing over him who had already moved on to thinking about freight delivery. The sponsors came first. 2 of them called within the same week, and the language in both conversations was almost identical, carefully diplomatic, expressing continued personal regard while making clear that the association was no longer something their brands could support. The third sponsor didn't call. They sent a letter through their legal department, shorter and more direct and somehow worse for its brevity. The gym membership numbers had been dropping since the story moved through the regional MMA community, which it had done with the Speed Stories move when they contained the specific combination of elements. This one contained an undefeated record, a truck stop diner, a parking lot in the rain, and a man who had asked for a tap and received one. No one needed to embellish it. The facts were already structured like something designed to travel. Derek came by the gym once, in the weeks after. He sat across from Marcus in the small office near the back and said what he'd come to say, that he was sorry for the parts he'd played in getting them to Kingman, and that he was going to move to his brother's place in Dallas for a while and train somewhere new. He said it without apology for the decision itself, only for the earlier choices. Marcus told him he understood. He meant it, which surprised him slightly. Tyler hadn't come. That was also something Marcus understood. Walter had the option to make the legal consequences considerably worse. His attorney had made this clear in their first consultation. The dashcam footage was unambiguous. The testimony of a cooperative witness was available. The charge structure could be expanded in ways that would resolve the question of Marcus's freedom for a meaningful period. Walter had chosen not to pursue that route. He'd said through counsel that he was satisfied with Marcus accepting full accountability for what had occurred, and with the civil resolution that followed. When Dawson had asked him at the scene why he was inclined toward restraint given the circumstances, Walter told him that he had a daughter who was learning how adults behaved by watching him, and that he didn't want to teach her that justice and punishment were the same thing. That answer sat at the center of everything. Emma hadn't made Walter softer. She had made him more deliberate about when force was necessary, about what restraint communicated, about the difference between power exercised for its own satisfaction and power exercised because the situation genuinely required it. He'd spent more than 2 decades in work that demanded the first kind of precision, and coming home to a daughter who was watching had given that precision somewhere new to apply. 6 months after the night in Kingman, Marcus was still running what remained of the gym. He'd sold the main training floor and 3 of the 4 equipment rooms to cover the legal fees and the civil settlement. What he kept was the back section, a padded room, a heavy bag, a modest mat area which he'd begun offering free to teenagers from the lower-income neighborhoods north of the highway. It hadn't started as a program with a name or a structure. It started because he needed to be in the gym to feel like himself, and because having other people there made the silence easier to carry, and because nobody questioned the logic of a man offering free instruction in exchange for the company. Danny showed up on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of the arrangement. He was 14 and big for his age. Not the hard muscle of someone who'd trained, but the loose, unharnessed size of a boy who'd grown fast and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the physical authority it gave him. He stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes before coming in, and when Marcus asked who had told him about the sessions, Danny said a cousin had mentioned it, and shrugged in a way that closed the question. Marcus let him train. He didn't ask for any other information. He sat in the parking lot until it was dark, then made a call to a man who knew the freight routes through Arizona. He found Walter at a diner outside Yuma 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening. It was a different diner from the one off Interstate 17, but the same general architecture: linoleum, yellow light, coffee in heavy mugs, the particular quiet of a place that serves people passing through rather than arriving. Walter was at a corner table with his back to the wall and his cap on the seat beside him, and a meal he'd barely touched. He looked up when Marcus came through the door, and the assessment that moved through his expression was quick and complete. His hands stayed where they were on the table. Marcus stopped several feet away and raised both hands, the left flat, the right open, showing the surgical scar along the base of the palm and the slight irregularity in the way the fingers rested. He said he wasn't there to fight. He said it simply, without performance. Then he stood and waited for Walter to make a decision. Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once at the seat across from him. Marcus sat down. He put his right hand on the table where it was visible. He looked at it, at the scar, at the slightly reduced grip the physical therapist said was probably permanent, then looked up at Walter and said he'd come to thank him. Walter's expression didn't change significantly, but something in it adjusted, a slight recalibration, as though he'd prepared for several possible versions of this conversation and this one required a different configuration. Marcus told him what the past months had looked like from the inside. Not for sympathy, he was careful about that, careful to present it as information rather than a claim on anything. He said he'd spent years understanding the black belt and the record as evidence of something about his worth as a person, and that the problem with that understanding was that it had no logical boundary. If the belt and the record were what made him valuable, then anything that threatened them threatened everything, which was why a spilled coffee mug in an Arizona diner had felt like something that required a response, and why a parking lot loss had felt like something that required correction, and why he'd driven to Kingman with 2 friends and aluminum flashlights to find a man who'd never wanted anything from him except to be left alone. He said that if he'd gone to Kingman and found someone carrying a gun instead of someone trained for 20 years in environments where guns were standard equipment, he'd probably be dead. He said that if he'd continued in the direction he was traveling, he'd eventually have done something to someone who was simply less capable than Walter of controlling the outcome, and the result of that wouldn't have been a scar on his hand. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting. When Marcus was finished, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable in the way silences are uncomfortable when neither party knows what to say. It was the silence of someone taking something in and deciding how to respond to the version of it that was actually true. Marcus asked why, that first night in the diner, Walter had let him speak the way he had, in front of Emma, in front of other people, in a situation where he clearly had the capacity to resolve it differently. Walter told him it was because Emma was there. He said it directly, without decoration. He said his daughter wasn't going to remember a number, not the years he'd served, or the operations he'd been part of, or the fights he'd been in or won or walked away from. She was going to remember the texture of how he behaved when someone pushed him, because that was what children carried forward from the adults they watched when they were young. He said that a man who could only demonstrate restraint when no one was provoking him hadn't actually learned restraint. He said the diner had been an opportunity to show her what it looked like to be pushed and to choose, and he'd taken it. Marcus said the black belt had taught him how to break someone. He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of what the training had produced. Walter told him that perhaps what came next was learning how to build one. He said it in the same tone he used for everything: level, without emphasis, the voice of someone not performing wisdom but simply reporting what he'd found to be true. The free program had already been running for 2 months when Walter and Emma came by on a Saturday afternoon in November. Marcus hadn't arranged it or expected it. They were passing through on a short run, and Walter had remembered the address from a conversation with Dawson. Emma came through the door behind her father and stopped when she saw Marcus across the mat, crouched beside a boy who'd just gone down hard and was working out whether he wanted to get back up. Marcus was saying something to the boy in a low voice. He looked up when the door opened and saw them. Emma moved closer to her father's arm. Marcus crossed the mat toward them and stopped at a reasonable distance. He looked at Emma and didn't ask her to feel comfortable with him, or explain what he was doing, or offer any framing for what she was seeing. He told her that her father had taught him something he'd needed to learn for a long time. He said it quietly and directly, then looked at Walter. Walter extended his hand. Marcus took it with his right hand, the scarred one, the one with the reduced grip, and they held the shake for a moment. It wasn't a contest. It wasn't two men measuring each other. It was something considerably less dramatic and considerably more significant, two people recognizing that a thing had moved through its full arc and arrived somewhere real. On the walk back to the Kenworth, Emma asked her father whether he could have beaten Marcus right from the start, from the very first moment in the parking lot. Walter unlocked the passenger door and held it open for her. He said he probably could have. She climbed up into the seat and looked down at him and asked why he hadn't. He told her it was because she was watching. She sat with that for a moment as he came around and got in and started the engine. The Kenworth moved out of the lot and found the on-ramp and settled into the right lane of the highway, heading north, steady and unhurried, covering distance at its own pace. Emma had her sketchbook in her lap, the same one from the summer, the cover still faintly stained from the spilled coffee she'd never complained about. She didn't open it. She looked out the window at the flat Arizona landscape moving past and thought about what her father had said. She wouldn't know then, or later, the full shape of what he'd done in the years before she was old enough to ask. She wouldn't know the operations or the places or the men who'd served under him or the weight of what those years had required. Walter didn't need her to know. The thing he wanted her to carry wasn't a record of his capability or proof of what he'd survived. It was simpler and more durable than that. It was the knowledge that the strongest person in a room isn't always the loudest, or the most aggressive, or the one who leaves the most damage behind when they walk out. Sometimes the strongest person is the one who looks at everything they're capable of and chooses, deliberately and without apology, to be something better than that capability alone would have made them. The highway opened ahead of them, long and straight, running northwest through the late afternoon light. Walter drove. Emma drew. The truck held its lane and covered its miles the same as it always had, the same as it would for as long as there were roads to run, and a daughter who sometimes wanted to ride along.